This is the third of my lectures on the French Revolution, and where we left off here is where Robespierre has gone crazy and he's made this new religion, the cult of the supreme being. They're going to worship the goddess of reason, goddess of wisdom, and he is not long after this shouted down in the assembly and guillotined himself with a lot of his followers. These are the sans-culottes. And at the end of the convention, the second part, they have all these economic problems. Bad harvest, as always. The landlords didn't have as much money because their feudal dues had been abolished by the National Assembly. So they raised the rents. Rents and dues, not the same thing. The industries that had made goods for the wealthy, think maybe of BMW or Audi, a custom, fancy car manufacturer. Poor people don't drive those things. Rich people do. So if the rich people, they're losing more money. The luxury industries are suffering. There had been some major transfers of land. The aristocracy had sold their land, I guess, to pay bills or lost it. And the church had lost pretty much everything. Remember, they'd issued those assignats, paper money backed with the sale of church lands. Now, here's the interesting thing. The people who had gotten land, which is mainly the middle and poorer classes, they had a vested interest in the revolution. So I've talked about this ad nauseum, over and over and over again, how these people wanted to own land. They finally get to own land. If the revolution goes down in defeat, they're going to lose all their land. They don't want to do that. And the other economic problem they have is that the War of Britain had damaged France's economy. So why was Napoleon able to overthrow the Directory? Well, the Reign of Terror had ended. I don't even remember what the chart on the board was. It's probably ACDC, not sure. So with the Directory, there were these two assemblies, the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients. And what they had done is they chose directors, and the directors are all from the middle class. And by the way, this is specifically directed to my students listening to this. I was doing some reading just before I started this. There's a whole lot of things in the directory I have not covered, which would explain what I said in class today about how I keep seeing all these directory questions that are pretty tough. I guess I was in a hurry in August when I did this lecture, September, and I skipped some of this stuff. So if you get a essay on the directory, I'm going to give you a little bit here, but it could be a bit of a problem. Anyway, the directors that are running this third form of the government are called the Directory. And what they did was they tried to keep the improvements of the revolution. They tried to keep the best parts because they knew the people wanted it and do away with most of the excesses like the Reign of Terror. So it's halfway between the terror and the ancient regime. So if you remember that chart I draw on the board, which is probably the one I'm talking about here, where I show the political spectrum, I show the left, and then I show the right in the middle. And so the ancient regime would have been pretty conservative. The Catholic Church and the monarchy were very strong. Then comes the National Assembly, which is was somewhere around the middle between the far left and the far right. And then you had the National Convention, which is hard left. That's where all the craziness happens. And then you have that right-wing revolution, the Thermodoran reaction, where they did away with the convention and brought in the Directory. So it's kind of halfway between the terror and the ancient regime. And the middle class had now gotten all this new wealth and new land, and they simply wanted to keep what they had. And you will remember this is a similar theme in the German unification. There were all those socialist revolutions in 1848, and what happened was, now, of course, I'm talking about a different unit now, but you see the similarities between Unit 1 and Unit 3. What you had is all these people trying to fight to overthrow the German or the Prussian government and the French government and the Italian government. You had all these revolutions, the Austrian government. And what happened was the monarchs were able to split the coalition. They were able to tell the middle class, look at all these socialist ideas these people have. They want to take away all your land and all your wealth and spread it amongst themselves. That is why the revolutions of 1848 all failed. So here you see kind of a common bond, common denominator. The middle class wanted to keep what they had. The government has no money. It does have the support of the army. And so here's the deal. So imagine you have the directory here. It's kind of in the middle or middle rightish. The Jacobins are on the left. They're the far left. This is the people from the National Convention. Now, many of them have been guillotined. You have them on the left, and then you have the royalists. And royalists are monarchists. They're people who want the king back, very similar to the whites in the Russian Revolution. The directory is kind of in the middle of these two groups. And the directory was kind of lucky that these two groups were fighting against them because they, once again, like the revolutions of 1848, they did not have anything in common. The royalists want the king, and the Jacobins are the ones who kill the king. So eventually, there's going to be a coup d'etat. Okay, the directory is going to kind of throw out some of its more liberal members, and they have new elections, and they launch this thing called the Coup of Fructidor, which I'm assuming is a spring month. I'm assuming that is something to do with fruit growing in the spring. And during this time period, France had been winning, so that's good news coming back from the front. And things in the government were actually getting better. Okay, so now what we're answering here is why Napoleon was able to overthrow the directory. So what we want to discuss is things that were successes and things that were failures, and be prepared for either essay question. What were the successes of the directory? What were the failures? So when the directory ends, that means the end of the revolution. And the rich, they're pretty much a minority now in the country. They were very, very unhappy with the higher taxes that had been placed on them by the National Assembly. Almost nobody's happy with the Constitution. And they had been going to these rich families, the government, the directory, forcing them to loan them money. And I said this wrong in class. The conscription we're talking about here, that is forced military service, what we call in the United States, the draft. That was directed against all Frenchmen, just not just the wealthy. So these people were upset that their sons were having to go off and fight in this war, and that they were having to loan this government money. Now, so these are the failures of the directory. What was the directory successful at? They had come up with a fair tax system, and they had tried to move the power base of the country from Paris, the central government, out to the smaller towns, but they had not done a really good job of doing that. And the people wanted a strong executive. So think of that in this country as not a strong Congress, but a strong president. If you think about it, the Senate and House of Representatives, the people who are elected there from these states, the House of Representatives elected in the United States from the different regions in the states, and each state has 2 senators. So that is kind of, the power has devolved out to the states. But these people wanted something like a strong king. And sitting out there in the wings watching all this are 2 people, Napoleon and AICE, and they both want to be the strong executive. And right during this time, they hit, the war had been going well, but they lose this major battle to Austria and Prussia. So people here are pretty upset. And here we go. AICE had been around for a long time before the Revolution of 1789, the storming of the Bastille even happened. He'd written a pamphlet, you want to write this down, called What is the Third Estate? And he was saying, now he's a priest. So he's siding, though, not with the first estate, he's siding with the third. He says, what is the third estate? And his conclusion is the third estate is everything. It is everything. This is the entire country of France. He'd been involved in all these different constitutions they had. At this point, he's one of the directors. Now, Napoleon had changed his political focus through the years. Originally, he had supported the Jacobin. Because remember, he is not French, he's Corsican. And so the Jacobin are like ruthlessly beheading all these upper class people. Napoleon supported that because it gives people that are not royal born or not noble born, it gives them a chance. And he was able to move up the ranks. But he had originally supported the Jacobin, but he changed his support to support the directory, rather similar to Trotsky changing from supporting the Mensheviks to joining Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Now, as I said in class today, one year there was a question on how good Napoleon was on propaganda. Well, he did run 2 newspapers. He ran one for the men in his army, and he ran one for the public. And as I said today in class, when he invaded Egypt, he had a brilliant military victory there. He won on land, but then the British Navy showed up and defeated the French Navy. So Napoleon had no way to get his army back out of Egypt over to France, so he abandoned it. I guess he got on a small sloop or very fast sailboat and escaped under cover of darkness, went all the way back to England, and he had the newspapers not print this story because it would look very bad for a person to have abandoned their army. He's going to do that again later on, by the way. But he didn't let that get in the newspapers. So Napoleon was very good at propaganda, if you get that essay question. As a human being, he's brilliant. He went from cadet to general in 5 years, absolutely brilliant. And at one point, he was in command of the troops in Paris, and he was at this time. And remember, he fired grape shot at the protesters marching in the streets, these sans culottes, and he used grape shot on them and saved the directory from being overthrown. So he and Sieyès kind of plot together to overthrow the directory. And what they're going to do is they're going to set up they're going to bring back the old Roman concept of consuls equals. And Sieyès thought, he could push Napoleon around. And Napoleon thought he could push Sieyès around. And it turns out Napoleon was right and Sieyès was wrong. So in the coup of 1799, they are actually going to take over the directory. These guys help them, and there's 3 of them running the consulate: Sieyès, Napoleon, and Le Brun, who I don't really think we need to know much about. And they set up the 3 consuls. This is known in history as a triumvirate. And who had used this idea first? Well, the idea of the consuls had come from ancient Rome, where there were 2 consuls of equal power. And the famous example is Pompey, who ruled the city of Rome, and Julius Caesar, who was off with the army. And the deal was, if you were the consul that was off with the army, you could come back to Rome. But once you got to the river, the Rubicon, which is kind of a small river, you were supposed to leave your army there. And so they told Pompey, here comes Julius Caesar with his army. And he said, oh, don't worry, he'll leave his army at the Rubicon like he's supposed to. And he did not. He crossed the Rubicon and brought his army in to Rome and took over the country, and eventually had Pompey wind up, being assassinated. I don't remember exactly how he died. But anyway, the term crossing the Rubicon means it's historical slang for you have gone too far. So Napoleon, because he thinks of the Roman Empire as the gold standard, and he always wants to be compared to the Roman emperors, he is going to use this consul term. And he was the first of the consuls. Again, Sieyès thought he could manipulate him, but he couldn't. And Napoleon actually took over from Sieyès and Le Brun. He was ambitious, and he saw that France wanted order. And he saw those, so he has an election, right? Anyway, here's the important stuff here. He takes over, but what were his domestic aims and achievements? Now, obviously, he was a tremendous military leader, but Cambridge is not going to focus on that much. They're going to focus on what he did. And I kind of compared him today in class to Lenin. Lenin was ruthless and took over Russia, but almost nothing of what Lenin did remains. His policies were considered failure by modern-day Russians. Napoleon's policies are still used today, so he's considered a great leader. What mars his place in the history books is all the wars he provoked and all the needless people who died in his wars. Subtract the wars out, he'd be considered a great individual. And he is, even so, even though he had the wars. So he was 30 when he was first consul, a young man. He had 3 goals: become ruler, bring peace to revolutionary France. He wanted to provide an effective government, that means efficient. He wanted to maintain the best of the revolutionary gains. And he wanted to have law and order. So in some ways, he's similar to Stolypin. Stolypin told, the Russian peasants, listen, I'll give you land, I will give you wealth, more than you've ever had, but you're going to have to follow the rules and you're going to have to obey the government. And I already talked about this. Sieyès should have known that Napoleon was not just a good general, but very authoritarian. He was what we would call a dictator wannabe, but he did not know that Napoleon was very rational, and he wanted to keep all those 1789 rights because as a Corsican fresh out of the military academy, he benefited from this idea of meritocracy. That is a word where you succeed on your own merit, not on who your parents were. And on this AICE exam, of course, they don't care what race you are or how much money your parents have or whether you're a star athlete on the football or basketball or baseball team. The only thing that's going to matter when you take this exam is how well you write. Now, Napoleon did not like democracy, so he's not going to really push a democratic system. He wants, of course, like Lenin, to be in charge. Lenin certainly didn't believe in democracy, even amongst the Bolsheviks. And he is determined to break the power of the sans-culottes, the radical left wing. All right, so now, the émigrés, these were Frenchmen that when the revolution started, they left the country. Some of them are caught trying to leave the country. The most famous example is Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. He let them and the radicals and the priests out of prison. Now, a lot of people would say this was a bad thing for him to do. They're like, well, you know, these people were all against the revolution. But what he's trying to do is make peace. And if you think about it, if he lets all these people out of prison, then it's possible. Hey, Lauren. So I'm back here. Sorry, my dog was barking. So here's another way to look at it. Once he lets these people out of prison, it's a sign that he wants a fair government, and he's willing to be very magnanimous and extend the olive branch and grace to these people. And so it creates an atmosphere of political and religious tolerance. And if you think about it, they're going to owe him, and they're going to be loyal to him. And he's got basically the same argument that Stolypin had in Russia: obey the law and live in peace. General amnesty, and amnesty, if you don't know what that is, it's forgiveness. In other words, all your sins are forgiven. Yes, you tried to abandon the country, but we welcome you back and we restore all the rights that you had. So he's interested in reconciliation, not revenge. And he has a new constitution approved by plebiscite. Now, what a plebiscite is where you do something, then you have the people vote on it. Remember, Lenin kind of did that. Lenin took over Russia, and then he had a vote thinking that the people would approve the Bolsheviks, and they didn't. And it was a huge embarrassment, so the Bolsheviks just kind of ignored it. So he has the people approve what he's done. And later on, during his rule, he became the consul for life. That means a dictator for life. That was approved by the people. And his saying was, he got a couple of sayings. One of them was, I alone represent the people. In other words, if I want it, then that's what the people want. And he also famously took Louis XVI's famous saying, I am the state, and turned it on its head and said, I am the revolution. All right, and here he is painted as a Roman dictator. So clearly, he has studied Roman history, and Napoleon was a student of history. The whole reason he invaded Egypt was he wanted to be like his military hero, Alexander the Great. The Romans used to build, whenever they would win a big battle, they would build this huge arch. And he built one of these in Paris. This is the famous Arc de Triomphe. And I'm pretty sure it's from the Battle of Austerlitz. So if you study Napoleon as a military leader, his greatest victory ever was this Battle of Austerlitz. And they call it the Battle of Three Emperors because there were three kings or emperors fighting, and Napoleon beat the other two who were allied. So he built this Arc de Triomphe in the middle of Paris. It's a big tourist attraction. And somebody else came along who had an eye on history, and that was Adolf Hitler. And so Adolf Hitler, when he conquered France, Paris, in World War II, he had his soldiers march through the Arc de Triomphe. And Hitler is basically saying, yeah, you used to have a great leader. A greater one has now arrived. And I love showing this picture here. This is Napoleon's tomb in Paris, and that is Hitler. When he took over Paris, he wanted to go see where the great Napoleon was born. So that Hitler clearly had his eye on history, just like Napoleon had his eye on history. All right. He set up new ministries, and he picked their leaders, and they reported directly to him. Now, here's one of the big things he did. he established or he strengthened the Bank of France. I think he may have created it because France has all sorts of financial problems. So he either establishes or rehabilitates or rejuvenates the Bank of France. He had spies and informers everywhere. Think of this as the spies and informers that they used in Russia. I don't know that he had secret police, but I imagine he did. He had people go through the mail. So he established dictatorial control of France. Of course, a lot of people were happy about that. If they liked the stuff he was doing and he went a little bit further than he was supposed to, they were okay with it because they preferred that to what they'd had before. He ended a rule by the sans-culottes. Any revolts happen, he put them down violently. He executed the leaders, but then he tried to restore to favor the others. So he might execute a few of the leaders, but not all of their followers. So he had a strong-fisted approach with lots of grace and forgiveness. And he was the toughest leader of France since Robespierre. He had press censorship. In the United States, we have freedom of the press. Remember, he's got 2 newspapers of his own, or so he did. So this goes to that question. Was he a good at propaganda? Well, apparently so. He had his own newspapers, and he shut down any other newspaper that showed him in an unfavorable light. So he shut down 73 of France's papers. If you had a theater and you were putting on a play, you could not put on a radical play. He used paintings and images as propaganda. So here we go again. Here's all sorts of evidence about how good he was at propaganda. Now, what was he like as ruler? Now, here's where we get into the meat and potatoes of what Napoleon was. Great. I love talking about the military stuff. I have some great stories about Napoleon. But what's important in the Cambridge course is what did he do when he was the unequaled, non-overshadowed leader of France. He made sure the middle class aspirations were met. In the United States, people say that the middle class rules the country. So if you want to be president of the United States, the idea used to be that the poor were too busy working multiple jobs to vote, and the rich, they were too few. So to run the United States, you had to have the middle class vote for you. And maybe they got that idea from Napoleon. He made sure that those people, the middle class, they had a way to financial and social success. And there's that word again. For some reason, I have a mental block with this word, and I frequently cannot remember it. I don't know why. A meritocracy is where you succeed purely on your own merit, not because of family connections or wealth. And again, the SAT, the ACT, AP exams, ACE exams, this is your way to prove, no matter your racial or religious background, that you're just as good or better than everybody else. And because of all this, because he's going to help out the middle class, and the concept of meritocracy helps out the poor as well, there's no longer really a threat that there'd be an alliance between the middle class peasants and city workers, because he's making an opportunity for all of them. He's trying to get them to buy into the system. And I tell my students all the time, that's what, by sitting in these upper level classes, the government is hoping that you can get into a good college, get a good education, follow, a normal American lifestyle, have a house, and, vote in elections, serve on juries. And I tell the kids that we are trying to get you, and I say we're trying to get you to buy in the system. Our country, we have a great thing going on here, and we want to keep it going. And to do that, we need to have our citizens buy into the system. So Napoleon is clearly illustrating this as an example. He stabilized the prices of basic essentials, and that's going to be like food. That's going to be like bread, eggs, things like that. And he, made sure that everyone had plenty of food. And because he won so many military victories, at least in the beginning, many people supported him. Everybody likes a winner. That's the saying. Now, what were his domestic policies? The question mark is there because the theory is I need to explain to you what domestic is. So normally when we talk about a presidential election in the United States, we discuss the person's foreign goals. In other words, how are they going to deal with other countries? What kind of military alliance are we going to have? And what are their domestic policies? Things like tax policy. What are the rules? So domestic means literally inside a country. Just like when we talk about domestic violence, that's usually a spouse beating the spouse, or a parent beating their children. That's domestic violence, violence inside the home. Domestic policies are policies inside a country. So here's what Napoleon stood for: equality before the law, religious freedom, protection of private property. Now, the reason I have U.S. there is, remember what the American Declaration said. Americans have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And remember, pursuit of happiness was originally, that whole thing was a quote by John Locke. And the original quote was life, liberty, and property. And so in the United States, when they talk about the pursuit of happiness, they very likely meant, in this country, you have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of property. You can make as much money as you want, own as much land as you want. And when you do have all that, you can make sure that the government protects it. Also, social, political, and economic stability. Sorry, having all sorts of interruptions here. Dogs barking, Alexa giving us reminders. The people wanted a middle way. It's very important for you to know this, between authoritarian government. That's what Louis XIV representative. Louis XVI, not so much, but he tried to be an absolutist. So these people want a middle way between an absolute dictator and radicalism. And Napoleon is going to try and give that to them. He is a dictator, but he's going to try and give them as much freedom as he can without it interfering with his rule. That's a pretty important statement for you to know. He made peace for a time with his military opponents so he could focus on domestic issues. It's important to remember this time period is 1789 all the way up to 1815. That is 30-something years that Napoleon was on the scene. And so he wasn't fighting all the time. And during this time, there was peace, and the French people were probably fairly happy. Now, Concordat. The word Concordat shows up a lot in AP European history. And here's my kind of definition on what a Concordat is. It's a deal between a ruler and the Catholic Church. So this stands for the Concordat with the Roman Catholic Church of 1802. And this was, one year there was an entire paper 2 question A on the Concordat of 1802. I actually thought it was 1801, but we'll go with what's typed here. Anyway, this is a deal he makes. All right, correct mistake. Oh, it's Concordat of 1801. I'm telling myself to fix it. Well, too late now. Many wanted de-Christianization to end, especially in the rural areas. So yes, this is the Concordat of 1801. Now we're going to take you back through history here to the National Convention. The National Convention had this real chip on their shoulder with the Catholic Church, and what they did was they went through a policy of de-Christianization. All right, so I fixed the problem. So going back to the second phase, the radical phase, they de-Christianized. They changed the number of days in the week from 7 to 10. And they did that so that Christians would not know which day Sunday was. They changed the name of the months from the so-called Christian calendar, the Roman calendar. They changed the names of the month. They forced the priests to swear allegiance to the state. And I would think, as a religious person myself, that would be an absolute insult, because the priests were supposed to be allegiant to the church and the Pope, not the civil government of France. They also executed quite a bit of priests. And so a lot of people during this time, they're just tired of them killing so many Christians, very similar to the Russian Revolution, although that went on for a long time. And especially in the rural areas. As I've pointed out many times, the rural areas were much more conservative and much more religious, and that exists in the United States today. If you're in the middle of a big city, it's going to be more liberal and probably less religious than it's going to be out in the countryside, where it is more religious and more conservative. So they wanted to end that, and so Napoleon is going to make peace with the church. And remember, he's trying to keep his enemies from overthrowing him. him. I don't know that he was afraid of them, but he just wanted to remove all challenges to his rule. So the royalists want a king back. That's what a royalist is. They're monarchists. They also want the church back. So by cutting a deal with the church, he can kind of take some of their fire away. And there are also Catholic lands he wanted to conquer. You know, he was interested in conquering Austria. That's a Catholic country. And he wanted probably to take over parts of Italy, certainly a Catholic country. And the Pope might help him do that. So he's not just doing this for political reasons to make his people happy. There's some things he wants that he thinks the Pope can give him. So in 1801, he started making overtures to the Pope. He started making nice with the Pope. And the thing is, there's lots of bitterness and anger. Imagine you're the Pope of the Catholic Church, and all your church's land has been taken away in France, or at least most of it. Many of your priests have been guillotined, and many of your followers have been guillotined. So there's a lot of anger towards the French Revolution, which Napoleon now embodies. And I am going to, got another typo here. I will fix that one too. I'm going to stop this video here.